So as we keep getting more intros from our participants, we'll hopefully see more of them on this board, and we'll come back to this in a second. Maybe I'll just do intros first, and then we'll come back here, and hopefully there are more people's profiles. So one of our panelists today is Kanika. She's a senior design strategy lead at Ideate. We've worked on quite a few projects together at this point, and Kanika has led a number of projects in South Asia, as well as North Africa. And as you guys probably know, with Ideate, the research methodology is, the design methodology is very deeply based in research. So a lot of the design decisions are made using ethnographic research methodologies and other methods to learn about our users, and then hopefully make design decisions that are based in what people want and need, rather than us sort of making decisions on their behalf. And Arsalan is our other panelist for today. Arsalan is the head of design at Bazaar. Bazaar is one of those startups in Pakistan, which we would love that number to be bigger, but I think so far is a relatively small sort of niche where startups which have been sort of built around, and where design has been a core sort of feature which the startup has been built around, rather than something that's brought on to fix the app or to build the app specifically, which is often how we tend to interact with startups here as well. But that seems to be changing, and I think people like Arsalan have played a big role in that. And our hope with bringing Kanika and Arsalan together for this conversation is that we've also seen in the past that people from startups and from design services firms can sometimes have different views on how to build products. And that doesn't necessarily mean that their views are opposing to each other. There might be different perspectives because I've worked way more on the services side and less on the product side. So my bias might often be like, hey, hire me, I'll do this for you. Whereas somebody in the product team might be like, oh, we don't have the time to hire you, even though we agree on the principles that we're building the product with. And one of the things we want to see is like just learning from both Kanika and Arsalan, and also seeing where potentially to find those balances between these two sort of potential ideologies and ways of thinking around product design. And then I am the host for today. I am the head of design at Ideate Innovation. And yeah, I've been here for a couple of years now. Before this, have also been sort of delving into design for quite a few years at this point. And now let's go back to our intro slides. So some of the people that we can see here, Book is another startup that I know of. Designist, Hassan from Designist. Hassan's a good friend, and Designist is a good friend to Ideate as well. So thank you for joining us. And Alicia from Ideate, great design firm. Oran's another startup. They're doing some really interesting work, and I know that they're very well sort of very cognizant of design and research. So that's interesting. Sarah, we've also worked with quite a lot from Ideate. Taha, LUMS research assistant. We have quite a few LUMS graduates in our team. The connection there. Osama from Orinda, that's Talimabad. Hassan and Osama from, I think that's another startup. Hassan, if you can elaborate, or if you know more at any point, please jump in. So there's Osama, Asad, and Hassan from the same. And then Leila from ShopDev, another designer, and then BridgeLinks, Shiraz, product design lead. So quite a few people with design in their titles. So that's obviously a very, probably our audience was likely to be biased that way. And I would assume that quite a lot of people here are also at relatively early on in their design careers. So that's sort of what the feeling we got from registrations as well. But one of the things we're looking to do in this conversation is keep it fairly open-ended. So as your comments and questions come in, we would like to, even though the questions will be answered at the end, we will try to bring some of the questions or the themes being brought up there into our conversation as we go along. Yeah, this was the schedule that we sort of put up. We're already sort of 5 minutes over in terms of the introductions, but that's okay. We've kind of kept a bit of buffer time in the middle in the panel discussion part. So we can have around 50 minutes for the panel discussion from starting just about now, and then hopefully 15 minutes for Q&A. But as I said, we might just incorporate some of the questions in our conversation as well as they start coming in. So yeah, let's talk. And maybe Kanika or San, if you want to say hi first, and then I can jump into the questions.
Hey guys, excited to be here.
Same here. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all, and looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you. So I was thinking that we, as I said, like we might be jumping into a few themes where both of you, the sort of our wins would be from getting both perspectives and sort of figuring out or helping people figure out where they might be. One of the first things I would also maybe like to start off with for Salan, especially with our focus on Pakistani startups or startups in the developing world here. I just want to know about or want to learn a bit more about the role design has played in Bazaar's journey. And if you want to reframe that question as well, that's perfectly fine. But just understanding sort of the value of design or how you sort of inculcated that design into how the startup has been built.
Yes, to be very honest, I have conflicting views on it, and it's both of the conflicting sides is like it's an internal battle, because part of me is like, yeah, design is everything, but at the same time, it's also that design is just part and parcel of everything around and as part of the broader theme. So another way to look at it, the question is, what role has the growth team or the engineering team or the operations team part in what role have they played in that? So it's really interesting to sort of put a very sort of specific lens on it. So for example, there is definitely a lot of the things where some of the outputs have definitely been very different because of design being involved. So this can stem, if you look at from a strategic lens, it's just having the sheer focus on the user and the problem. So I think one of the biggest advantages which we've had is just, for example, having leaders who buy in to the whole idea of it being design led and user led. What it enables us to do is that it's basically 99% of the problem has already been solved for us. So then it really reciprocates in every sort of step of the journey. So what part of design played? I would say that we've definitely gotten user validation at all points. Even before we had applications, we had a very, we were continuously learning, but we still have a very good idea and a building view on what the problem is which the user is facing, and then continuously being able to validate that. Generally, what we've also seen where startups usually go haywire is when they're not able to achieve the fit or the product market fit. So that is where naturally design gets involved, because you're then automatically asking a lot of the same questions, but not from a business lens, but also computing the user lens in it. So that's one side of the argument. But the other side of me is like also saying that, hey, what if design wasn't there? I would probably say that chances are that there, again, maybe the same entities, the same sort of milestones would have been reached. But I think the chances of that probably would have varied, because that would assume that someone from the non-design team, so either the product or engineering or business teams, would be playing some of these roles. So I do think that it's not necessarily that the role of design has anything to do with it, but some of these sort of mindsets, which I really feel have been essential. And what I personally love about it is just not within the design team, and it's not something which is just specific to the design team, and it's more of more of a mindset which we've been able to sort of expand as we've also grown. So I think that that's the core. I'm not sure if that answers the question though, but I feel that that's like a premise or the foundation, and then everything is like a second order solution or a second order artifact to it.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that also sort of speaks to the impression that I think we've gotten as outsiders looking at Bazaar and sort of the reputation around design that Bazaar has formed. Basically, the fact that that question isn't easy for you to answer is, I think, speaks to the fact that it's not like, hey, we brought in 5 designers, we paid them this much, that's why product looks like this, right? It's a much more sort of, it permeates through the organization rather than a thing that's added on top. So yeah, that actually answers my question for sure. Sort of building off that, I think, Kanika, one of the things that we in our services sort of practice, see or struggle with sometimes, and you have a lot more experience in that, is that we might work with somebody like, say, a startup like Bazaar, and we learn some things around that sort of space and such this fintech area. We've covered a certain type of user, and then 6 months later or a year later, some other startup or some other firm we're working with or problem we're working on might have a lot of overlap with similar problems, but we struggle with sort of deciding what to take from the previous project into this, because as researchers, the sort of theory is that you want to more or less start from scratch. You don't go in with assumptions, but there's always a temptation, because you're like, oh, we've spent 200 hours looking at this problem before. Why don't we just take those learnings here? So how do you sort of balance that need, and also you don't want to be just taking previous learnings?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think what we've learned is probably two things. I think one, for all products, either say products designed for a particular user type, say underserved communities who are low literate, or say in a particular sector like fintech or edtech, there are certain product principles that tend to emerge that are broadly applicable across products, and that to some degree can be, I wouldn't say lifted and shifted, but to some degree can be contextualized, but at least the basis of it remains the same. So for example, I think I was mentioning this to you, I think we all understand and recognize the send button in a chat interface, and that sort of now come to be as the enter button in many interfaces, right? Like when you want to send something, when you want to make an action that is that wants you to move to the next step, and that really comes from habit formation, and that also comes from a level of abstraction and creation of product and design principles that are broadly applicable. Having said that, when we come to research, I think it's always safe to believe that each user has a very unique perspective, very unique context in which they live and in which they operate, and therefore the product needs to fit into their lives. The one thing that we do that I think has worked is we take a hypothesis-driven approach to research, and I think to be open to failure. I think Arslan was mentioning this. I think design is more a philosophy than I think a functional area. I think there is some functional aspect of it. Hey, design my product to look a specific way or to be interactive in a specific way, and I think that's the functional aspect of it. But I think there's a lot of design that is more a philosophy. I think it's a matter of prototyping, iterating, and learning with the users. And I think the way to accelerate some of that learning is to take a hypothesis-driven approach. If I've learned from one fintech company that users feel less trust in sending their money for the first time, what's an easy way for them to try before they leap, right? And so I know that users want to try before they make their first transaction. And so then I take that hypothesis and then I do my research and understand whether that hypothesis still holds with another user group in another context. And that's one way I think we've learned to accelerate some of the product design and research work that we do with users. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
yeah, no, you definitely have, and that makes a lot of sense. I think the point you made about sort of referring back to Rasan's as well, where one being open to failure, I think seems like a big part of this, because if you're going in with some hypotheses, but you've already sort of set your mind on what you want out of that research, you will come out with knowing exactly that. And I feel like, and this might be something that you can elaborate on further, with the way you're talking about these principles that are sort of being formed over time, and you can bring them back into research. Is this where something like sacrificial concepts might come in as well? And maybe you can sort of elaborate on what those are for people who might not know.
Yeah. So the best way to learn is by doing, right? But you also don't want to learn by investing too much. And so you want to fail fast and you want to fail cheap. And a philosophy that Idea really lives by and truly like advocates is how do we create the thing in a low fidelity way? So how do we make something look and feel like the real thing that we eventually want it to be? So sacrificial prototypes can be as simple as paper drawings. So we like sketch out the screen, for instance, if it's a digital product, or if it is something that's more physical, we create a space that, with really cheap and dirty stuff that we have around us. I think everyone that's here is a designer and would have heard of the Apple example where they made the first mouse using the rotator thing from the deodorant bottle. So what are quick and dirty ways for us to create sacrificial prototypes to get reactions from people? I think that's one thing. But I think deeper than that is I think what are we learning through those sacrificial prototypes, right? We just don't want to create a sacrificial prototype for the sake of creating one, but is there a hypothesis or is there a question that we're trying to answer? And really making sure that we know what question we're trying to answer with that prototype is, I think, the most fundamental part of design research and design thinking.
Got it. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that might connect Arsalan to the idea of MVPs, which are very common in the tech space, where startups are always just like investors, always like MVP, show us build an MVP, throw it out there, and so on. Which has some of the same ethos, where you have a product out and you start testing it, but the stuff Kanika is talking about might be even sort of earlier and even quicker. Is there, in your sort of journey at Bazaar and maybe in your other experience, is there sort of any sort of tension between these two, or does this sort of flow nicely into each other? What sort of balance is there?
Which is the second one? So first is the MVP. What's the second one?
So things like just building quick prototypes to test out with users and getting them rejected, essentially. Sacrificial prototypes, which you might have just done on paper and stuff of that sort.
So I think there will always be tension when when you equate anything with time. So our first I would say bias would always be to ship it ASAP. And again, that is where all products and startups like really double down on, which is speed, right? But I think the trade-off which generally has to happen, and where we see a lot of the crux of it, is basically that are you validating whatever you're up against, right? And then again, there are a lot of tools and mechanisms which can support you with it. You have the riskiest assumption test, and you have these X and Y tools, which are like, again, it's crazy how many resources we have, but at the same time, it's still as ironic that we still have a lot of the failures on the foundational things when it comes to the user side of things, right? So it's actually very interesting. We keep on building so many tools which are supposed to have, but at the same time, we're still coming back to square one when we come across the same problems, and eventually is the paper prototypes, is the quick and dirty things which are then really supporting us. So I think there's definitely tension. I think what the variables there is how much of the problem space you are aware of, how much relatable references or existing infrastructure you're aware of. For example, is there competition already there? Does your user already aware of the infrastructure? Are they already using certain applications which are similar? Again, that is something that which then dictates the maturity of the solution. I think naturally any builder would want to build it ASAP. Like any team would want it out the door ASAP. But I feel where the tension is usually is on the maturity of the hypothesis. Like how close are you to in terms of validating, and then your confidence level, to be very honest. Because the whole principle of the whole ideology behind the MVP is that it's supposed to be imperfect. And then generally there are a lot of different quotes, but one of the quotes also says that if it's working really well, you probably will like shipped it a bit late, right? So it's supposed to be raw and dirty, but that's where the friction is, to be very honest, where the more control, like on the product side, generally on the designer or the product team would have a bit more control on when to say yes versus when to say no. versus on the services or on the other side of the conversation, the scope is a bit sort of restrictive from that side as compared to it. That's
Got it.
at least what I've seen.
That makes a lot of sense. I think what's interesting here is that, and I've wondered about this before, and I think between you and Kanik, you've sort of made that connection as well, where these are very similar principles if you think of the philosophy of the thing, right? Like building an MVP, the objective isn't to build the MVP. The objective is to get feedback really quickly so that you know what you want to do next. And similarly, when you're prototyping in design, that the objective isn't to build that prototype. As Kanika said, you don't just build sacrificial prototypes because you have to. You build them because you know what you're testing, and then you're trying to test it as soon as possible. So that might be interesting for like maybe somebody at a startup which with a smaller team, for instance, where there is alignment in the philosophy behind the two, sort of the design approach to this and a very common MVP sort of approach, which is very common in tech. So they aren't that far away. There might be different ways of, and potentially if you want to convince, as a designer, you want to convince your tech team in a startup, that could be a nice way of connecting the two. You're doing the same thing. You just want to test it even earlier, potentially, when we come to sacrificial prototypes and sort of paper prototypes. So just sort of in this, while we're on this topic of these different ways of working, and maybe I can start with you, Kanika, on this. When a lot of startups, we've worked with a lot of startups, you work with way more startups than us. And then we often have this thing where potentially the startups looking to work with us as a services firm might have an appetite for getting these external designers involved, researchers involved, but also there's always going to be a challenge to meet their internal sort of product demands. And often startups have these, by sort of need, have very quick sort of cycles that they need to send their product through. And as researchers and designers, we're like, let's test this out a little bit more, and that sort of problem. So how do you balance that? And maybe then Arslan, you can jump in later, talk about potentially the pros and cons of bringing people from outside in for this sort of problem solving.
Yeah, I think this goes back to Arslan's point. I think there is always a tension between like agility and trying to get this absolutely right and learning everything before we go out, right? And so there has to be a comfortable in between, both for us as designers, whether we're inside the team or outside as consultants, as well as for the, I think, say the product owners or the business people who are managing the business, right? Because you got to keep the lights on and you can't shy away from that. My sense is that there are a couple of things that as designers, whether we're internal or external, that we might do to build more, I would say more willingness to learn and to research with users, and not to just go ahead and build before you learn. And I think that is to create belief and to build evidence around the process itself. I remember we were working with a fintech firm, in fact, in Pakistan. And in the early days, I don't think the firm really fully understood the design thinking methodology or approach. And so there was a lot of concern about us spending 12 weeks just learning to design the product, right? And there was also a lot of concern because it was during the pandemic, and we said that we're going to do a hybrid team. In fact, Ali, we work with you guys, so you know this as well as we do. But it was a dramatic turnaround from our first meeting, where the team was so skeptical, was so apprehensive about spending 12 weeks just investing in design research and designing the product. But at the end of the 12 weeks, I think we saw stars in their eyes. They were super excited because the kind of insights they got through the process of learning by doing, through the process of putting sacrificial concepts out there, they realized that actually you can move from research to design pretty quickly. You can move from research to MVP pretty quickly if you follow a certain process and system. And but I think the first few weeks of building that familiarity with the process, building belief in the process, and building evidence that this works. Every partnership, every collaboration that we've gone through goes through that initial kind of hiccup period. Sarah, who's on the call here, can tell you all more about it. She manages that project. But really, I think it's about building evidence and building belief in the process before. I think it's unreasonable to expect people to just trust right from day one.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Arsalan, maybe you can sort of elaborate on that from this product team perspective, but also potentially if you want to connect it to the needs at a smaller startup and a designer who maybe wants to play the same role as an external firm was playing in this case, where getting that buy-in from other stakeholders within the firm. And in case of a smaller startup, that might just be a one-person design team trying to convince the rest of the product team. So that sort of insight would be really useful here.
So I think what was funny was the moment Kanika mentioned 12 weeks for just research. I was like, oh. That's some conversation which would have happened in those boardrooms, and the sort of buy-in and the conversation is definitely intense, because that's almost like a quarter. And then if in startup terminologies, the earlier you are, the quarters, like the amount of expectation in a quarter is just crazy insane, and that's how generally it decreases over time as scale increases, right? So the speed decreases over time, the complexity increases over time, the potential sort of consequence of collateral damage increases over time. So that's where speed sort of slows down. But I think coming back to the 12-week, I feel that's again one very interesting chain of conversation which will definitely happen. I think on the flip side, if there is a designer very early on from the startup side of things, I feel even before getting in the designer, unless like the designer is either the co-founder or founder or very early on being involved, someone is still playing the designer part anyways. So if because from if you look at generally the startups who've had either good starts or generally have been considered good startups, you would naturally see the founders being very, very close to the users from the get-go. So what has actually happened is that the designer was part and parcel of the role of the designer was played by either the co-founder, like one of the founders, or both of the founders, or all three. So I feel that, again, like you said, the functional aspect of it can be split across multiple roles. Like I still remember back in the early days, it was peak COVID. For a lot of reasons, I couldn't like go out, and then but we still had to validate. So I still had enough sort of references and a team on the ground who was going anyway. So we would still be talking about prototypes. They would still have the Figma links. They would still be able to validate it. It wasn't perfect. Obviously, if we had to revisit it and do it better, we could definitely have done it, and we did iterate over time. But I feel a lot of it is very much contextual based on the situation. I feel for sure like waiting and processing the research is almost at least in my experience, I haven't seen it work, at least on the startup phase in the early days, because I feel that the delta of the wait time is almost impossible to visualize, or it's a very, very steep battle to convince someone, is all I'm trying to sort of say, because the scope is relatively clear from a business lens. It's just about validating so the end goal is sort of set, but the direction is still something, or the way or the route is something which you have to prototype and experiment your way. But the direction is something which, even with the investors, even something before it starts, the co-founders have a good sort of clear vision in mind with reasonable milestones. So I think that part is usually where a lot of the core exploratory research and a lot of these findings usually help it. But in the case of startups, what you would see is that the founders usually would have a good grasp of the problem space, at least, so that it become that sort of bypasses some of the need of the initial research, which, for example, Kanika was mentioning. So I feel that's where it's a bit different. The execution, I think, once that phase is once you're sort of over that bridge, then I think the steps are again similar, and that's where a lot of it is overlapping.
I do have to just quickly to respond to Arslan. I completely agree. I think it all depends on the brief, right? Like we've had briefs that we've done 1 week sprints in, where we've gone from research to actual design. That is pretty I don't think shippable, but very close to being shippable within a week. If the brief is very specific, like if you come in and say, hey, I just want to look at the home screen, please help me reimagine the home screen because people are not cannot find what I want, right? Like, so if you come in with a very specific brief, I think you can use the design approach to do something in 1 week. But I think if you're really trying to understand where in the lives of these users does this product fit and how do they engage with it, where should it be present in their life, where should it come up, how should the experience show up for them, I think then you do need a longer time. And I think it's all about the nuances, right? From that 12 weeks on, I don't think they have to invest that kind of time again once it's done. So yeah, just wanted to add that,
No,
clarify that not all
I
sprints are 12 weeks.
100% agree with that. Like I feel the core has always been about how much of the space do you not know, and in most cases, like you're also highlighting a very important point, right? It really depends on how much, like, not only the brief, but how much of the product or end solution is being has been navigated. So if it's been
Exactly.
navigated, then it's specific, but it hasn't been navigated. It's probably going to take some time before they land on some direction. So I think if then from that lens, I'm probably just being very specific to assumptions that it's being only scoped one, like in the product side, it's usually after being scoped down and it's been narrowed to a particular lens.
Agree. I think
Yeah,
the one thing. Oh,
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
I was just going to respond to Aslan. I think the one thing that you brought up, Aslan, around as companies grow bigger, the trade-off is obviously, they tend to get further and further away from their users. I'm just wondering, from your own example at Bazaar, like, are you doing things to make sure that you'll continue, and not just the founders, but everyone in the company continues to remain close to the users? Like, is that something as a product team you'll emphasize on, you'll focus on, or do you feel like it's not needed after a certain point?
So this one was primarily coming. So again, it's still like in from the lens of Bazaar, it's still a bit too early. It's been less than 2 years, so it's still like very early. So this was coming from more of an observation of, for example, some of the experience from Kareem or some of the stories which we heard of Uber and a lot of these tech giants, and then some of the stories from there. But naturally, I think there are some reminiscence which have already started from our side as well. So I think the key is to transfer whatever the mindset which you are referring very early on to each up and coming layer of talent, which they're now they're taking the charge of the initiatives. So the whole idea is to carry forward this mindset, right? So for example, let's say if there was one designer, they had a particular mindset and a chemistry between the product team, so they were working in a particular fashion. In principle, nothing should break if the same chemistry is cascaded to different teams as they scale. So regardless of how many squads or teams or tribes they're working as part of, if this chemistry stays intact, regardless of the business vertical or technical domain, it should in principle be the best case scenario. I think what usually happens and where this breaks is where there is a difference in opinion in terms of priority of what is equally important. And I think that's where a lot of the things usually go wrong. So I think from our side, I think, again, like I said, we've personally been blessed that it's still a repetitive conversation, and we communicated profusely that we were solving for user problems. Whenever we're in doubt, we ask the user. We're continuously looking at the data, which helps us create more hypotheses if or even challenge our own. It seems to be too good to be true, so we still challenge that. Hey, what's happening? How is it working so well? Like, what's happening? So there's always something to be learned. So I feel that, for example, that curiosity can be cascaded to as big of an organization as you get. So I feel the question then becomes that, hey, who takes the charge? And my bias is that it should never be the designer, and it should be like a mindset which is just cultivated across.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was just earlier pointing out that, Kanika, as soon as you mentioned the 5-day time, Arsalan's face lit up. It was like, now we're talking. Now we're on the same page here. But yeah, I think that was a very, I think, important clarification as well, because it's sort of like the 12 weeks is definitely like a luxury for any sort of research. And then there's a balance, and you always want to sort of, you can't get anywhere without business goals being front and center as well. But I think to Arsan, when you were explaining this sort of transition from Kanika's question, something else that I think is important to discuss is just we've talked about local needs, like figuring out, or we've sort of alluded to them, learning about your users in a specific place. But then most startups eventually want to make it big and want to go from like that one city that they started off with to becoming Uber and Careem and multinational startups. So how do you balance that? Like you're trying to learn about your users in a specific place, but you also then have goals of becoming a unicorn and all of that, and hopefully you get there. But is there any problem between these two goals, or is there a way to balance? And either of you can jump in on this.
Kanika, you want to start?
I have not worked with a company that has gone from from zero to unicorn or anywhere on that path, but I can give an outsider's perspective on it. I think if your fundamental product has product market fit, so for example, we were working with a neobank in the Middle East, and fundamentally they're a neobank, right? But as they move from country to country, I think their use cases or their value propositions kind of alter. So in the Middle East, I think they position themselves more as a bank for remittance for all of the migrant workers to remit back to Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, other countries that most migrant workers there live. Whereas when they moved to Kenya, there they realized that savings was a bit of a missing piece in the market. And so then their entry kind of product feature, not product, feature was a savings solution, right? So I think if your fundamental product kind of addresses an unmet need, in most cases, there are financially excluded people. So a neobank, which is easily accessible, has fewer barriers to entry. The markets you select need to be relevant. Of course, you can't expect it to work in all markets, but if you select the right markets, then what you need to do is just find those right features or value propositions to onboard or on-ramp these users into your product. So my sense is that's potentially how you scale. I remember in India when Uber came, I think one thing that they started off with was luxury cars, because people were just so excited to like enter a party or go somewhere in like these really fancy Mercedes or Audi. Then I think the value proposition was just like automatic payment, right? Like, so what are those value props that you play up in each market that's contextually relevant to those markets? Having said that, fundamentally your market selection needs to be right, and your product needs to have some relevance in that market. But if it is a globally relevant product, then I think it's about identifying those feature sets to on-ramp into the product. But Arslan definitely has more thoughts on this, I'm sure.
Yeah, but that makes a lot of sense too. Like it's essentially the core needs to be strong, and then you can potentially build layers on top that might be more contextually relevant as you expand into different spaces. But yes, Arsalan's experience.
No, I think so. Kanika, you've already, I think, put it very. You summarized it really, really well, because what essentially happens in where we're seeing the expansion topics, if you look at it from a strategic lens, it's always an active conversation, right? Because as any sort of product team, the questions which everyone asks, again, we probably ask it as designers as well, if we're designing for a particular set of audience, let's say geographic, we've decided on a geography for it, then what are other geographies where we're finding similar people, or where we have like a union in terms of the feature set or the problem set? And that is where what we'd see is typical expansion plans. The next step has always been, hey, we're doing this because we feel that this population is going through a similar set of problems. And we feel that given the market landscape, wherein we already are in a much better position than some of the existing alternates or counterparts. Then that seems to be a very similar narrative whenever some entity is expanding beyond their home geography. However, what I've definitely seen is, depending on how well do you really know the niche of the newer markets you're entering, it really determines your long-term success in that particular location. We have a lot of precedents set again in the ride-hail space, not just with Uber, but we see a lot of these acquisitions happening here and there, where there is definitely one leader, but then other entrants come in. We see a lot of these things and this movement happening. But I feel the crux has to come down to what are your foundations, and then depending on your growth or expansion plans, where else are these foundations really making sense? And the more sort of closer the audiences are, the chances are the more the lesser rework which will be required. And then depending on the area, there might be some additional considerations to be done, which I feel, for example, when ride hailing came here, if you look at the Western example, that was all credit based, but then when they came here, they had to now figure out how to deal with cash, which was like a very alien concept for a lot of ride hailing players regardless. And even till date, this is something which a lot of local entities are utilizing to their advantage, because cash management, if someone knows from the ride hail context, they're able to have a better narrative when it comes to talking to the customers, because they're already aware of the pain points of what credit does to, let's say, the driver or other entities, where we're just a very heavily dependent on cash economy. So all of those factors, then it's like critical to making sure we're aware of if we have to like expand like gracefully. There can still be the growth which comes in, but a lot of it is either artificial or comes at the cost of dollars, growth dollars, or a lot of the different sort of burn terminologies which are probably existing out there.
Right. I think that
sorry, just as Aslan was speaking, there was this theory that I read about a while ago. I just Googled it to confirm who brought it up. So this was Kunal Shah, who's a really popular founder here in India. He runs Cred right now. He spoke about something called Delta 4. So if your experience ranks 4 points higher than the current experience, he says it's almost an irreversible experience. And so some of the things that many of these global unicorns or even country-based regional unicorns have been able to do, in his opinion, have been they have increased or improved the user experience by at least 4 points. So if you rank going to an airport and booking a ticket at 3, and you rank sort of booking it on a travel platform at 7, then it's unlikely that your user will revert back to the previous experience. And always think of that as we build user experiences. Is it like, by how many points are we actually improving the user experience, and what kind of inconvenience are we solving for them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that sort of quite a few of these answers keep coming back to is sort of understanding that problem space that you guys have alluded to quite a few times, where when Arslan was talking about expanding into different places and you were before that, there's some area where if you understand the problem spaces in these new places, you can probably first select the place or select the region to expand to in a sort of in a more informed way, and then probably have better hypotheses that you can test quicker. And if you haven't understood that specific problem space in that new context, you're probably going to struggle with that initial part. And that, again, at startups, that struggling for even a little bit can be the difference between making or breaking. And I think Arslan also alluded to the cash thing with ride hailing. I remember really early on when Kareem came into the Pakistan market. Actually, I think Uber came to the Pakistan market. Kareem was doing better. And one of the reasons was Kareem, everyone was paying by cash firstly. And then what Kareem would allow you to do is, if I could give if I gave 1,000 rupees and my bill was 700, Kareem would add 300 to my account. And that was such a big difference, where I would never use Uber because Uber didn't do that. I had to get change back, and that was a whole hassle. And sometimes they wouldn't have change and so on. But yeah, that seems like a very just one example of just having one of those problems figured out at a localized level that can completely change the sort of competition, even when the other competitor might have a lot more money, a lot more traction in other ways.
And then there's more to it. And it's also like very interesting you mentioned that, because now if you look at the current landscape, you have InDriver. So they're actually capitalizing on the credit as a thing. So they don't have credit. So what they've counted on is the insight that the driver side doesn't like customers topping up their wallets because that delays their payments. So then their claim to fame is that, hey, we'll make sure the customer doesn't store additional amount and you get whatever cash you were expecting on the ride. So it's very interesting where one problem, one solution to a problem creates more solutions to new problems. And it's like a recurring cycle. So it's very, very interesting. Eventually the customer gets a lot of options, but yes.
Yeah, it's startups all the way down.
Yes.
One startup creating another. I think this is a really nice conversation so far and flowing really nicely as well, but we have a bunch of questions as well at this point. So maybe we can just jump to those, and we'll probably keep coming back to similar areas in those questions as well. So I'll just share my screen again. We have, I think, 8 questions listed. They've been picked by one of our team members from all the ones that we received in the chat. I actually haven't seen these yet. Okay, one of the ones, I'm just reading the shortest one first, which is how to get out of / get over the failure of an MVP, which feels like it'd be very relevant for anyone working at a startup or trying to build a product. So yeah, let's start with that.
I think the failure is just getting it out. Usually failure is associated the amount of time you've invested in it. So the best thing which I've noted is that based on obviously like some data, you have some sort of assurance that it's the quickest which you can get out. But it's completely part of the process. Failure is part of the process. So it's not really, it's just a matter of the mindset. And this mindset usually is cultivated through time and just making sure you do it again and again and again. What usually, what I've seen work really, really well usually is when one set of stakeholders, let's say they're not buying into the concept of MVP, is just a matter of them trusting one instance where they're able to iterate over an MVP till this really, really see results. Usually once they've gone through a cycle, they do see the value of it and they do even learn from it, and they try to apply the same ideologies in other parts of the business. So I think the first time has to be some authoritative state. I think just to keep it very, very clear, that needs to be coming from top down. It's very difficult to have this conversation bottom up because you're already have a steep sort of barrier to overcome. And not only are you suggesting to do something raw, but you're also suggesting to fail. So that usually can only happen when you generally have stakeholders who are buying in. So if they're not buying in, then someone needs to do the talking. So you need to get support with that talking, ideally.
I think I'll just plus one to that. The only thing I'd add is to think also of failure as a moment of iteration. So instead of thinking that you failed at this moment, you understand what has not worked and you use it as a moment to iterate. So like Arslan said, it's a philosophy. So to shift from thinking of it as a failure to thinking of it as a moment of iteration.
Yeah, and I think just on that note as well, we've seen quite a bit about how that's something that you can also preempt to some degree by setting up the right expectations, right? So when a client comes to us to help them design their product, we were having this conversation 2 days ago with a client where their question was like, once your time with us is over, how will we is the product done? And we can set a false expectation there by saying like, yeah, once we've designed the product, it's perfect. But if our expectation that we've set is like, hey, we'll do our best job based on these criteria, we'll help you do this. but this will be a thing that you'll have to keep iterating on based on some of the things that we'll share with you. So again, at a startup as well, making sure that when you're building that MVP, thinking about why you're building that MVP, which is to test something out. And when you're testing something out, there's a chance that it goes wrong or you made the wrong decision. But if that expectation was already there, I think it's easier to just have another version. But if the expectation was like this will solve the problem, then it's going to be a harder sort of sell to bring it back. Actually, if do you guys want to pick a question? If you can read through a couple of these, I think that might be instead of me sort of biasing things here.
I think maybe just go sequence wise. I'm not sure.
Sure. Okay.
Selecting, so because that's the same bias. Like we'll all be biased. I feel.
Yeah, fair. So how can we evaluate the long-term impacts of the particular populations where your research insights were generated or product was developed? I think, yeah, Kanika, this might be something that in terms of impact might be something that you'd be interested in.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of setting up some rigorous data and monitoring systems, which I think most product teams today do, because it's a matter of improving their product experience, adoption, and product performance. So I think doing that, of course, I think that's the most straightforward. Another thing that we've been aiming to do or trying to do is, and I think this there's a 7th question here as well. Question number 7 around using quantitative analytical data. We have brought on board actually in cases where we have worked with product teams. Once the MVP is out in the market, once there's a pilot and to some degree the product is scaled, we've brought in impact evaluators or data analysts to actually do some quantitative research as well as data analysis of the product performance to actually give us some real insights on whether the product has performed or not. And I think that's always helpful to get, say, a third-party unbiased review. It's not always feasible for a company to invest in that, and it's not always necessary. But if there are questions coming up, I think we've had some success, and we've learned a lot actually bringing on board firms like 60 decibels and others to actually do some data measurement for us.
Got it. And would you consider, is there sort of a timeline that you're looking at around these? Is there sort of a rough sort of figure around that, or is that very dependent on the product and the situation?
I think it's dependent on the product or situation, but it's also fair to say that you should let the product be in the market for some time, because typically impact, and since we've used long-term impact here, longitudinal studies, and to actually see how the product has actually made a difference in people's lives, I think you have to think of it more as a longitudinal study as opposed to something that you just come in and if the product was launched yesterday, you do it in 2 months. I think you'll see lesser results. So if you're able to do something more rigorous, like an RCT or over 2 years, you're able to study the impact. I think that's obviously a lot more, I think, impact and data driven.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And I think I saw on the next question, is it more directed to you? So I'll just point it at you. What's a difficult conversation we need to have to make sure design stays at the table? Can Aslan share an example from Bazaar Tech? But I would imagine you can add Kareem to this as well.
I think one of the biggest realizations have been the table itself. So the even the definition of like the participants of the table keep on changing for me, what I've realized, because it really depends on like what sort of a table, what category of the table is it. Are we referring to it that, hey, we need to have similar conversations for headcount? We're revisiting budgets. Do we consider anything for design? I think just proactively looking at it. I think the difficult conversation usually have always been about budgets. And I personally feel this cascades in a lot of different tangents. So this can be, let's say, do we prioritize budget for research? Do you prioritize budget for, let's say, even external sort of validators or researchers, or like having this bias for making sure that we're actively doing this and allocating budgets for it? And then the relatively simpler answers, hey, we need a new designer. Our team is expanding. Do we then allocate the budget for it? Do we feel that we're stretched? I think the difficult conversation has always been about trade-off. So then you're basically almost, the question you're basically asking is that, hey, instead of getting 5 additional members in team X, do we get 4 additional members in team X and maybe 1 additional designer or 2 additional designer? So I think though the nature of those conversations really vary on the situation, but just making sure there is design representation on the table is again rooting back to the mindset shift. So in most cases, what I've also been blessed with is others vouching for making sure, hey, design representation needs to be here. And it's not usually me just shouting one way, almost like hitting my head on the wall, but also just making sure others making sure, hey, there's a missing piece of the puzzle. Let's make sure that it can be like a slip. Someone might have forgotten to add them to the meet because that other person was new to it. But as a collective, you need to have checks and balances. So just in case design isn't, even if design isn't there, someone can always vouch for you and have your back. So I feel it has to be like a collective effort, and it needs to be cultivated.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that also points to something that we feel or we felt over the years, where designers sometimes make this mistake of sort of siloing themselves into their own bucket. But your answer sort of is on the basis that the designer or the design team also understands other problems within the startup and what other basically understanding everyone else at the table as well, so that you can have the conversation about balancing things. But if you
I
come
think
just
just like just to quickly like contextualize it in an example, let's say you're working with team A, which is working with customer success, right? So the conversation you're basically questioning is that, let's assume you're working very closely with 3 members of the team, which is looking after customer success. So naturally, the closer you're working with these guys, if a meeting happens where design needs to be represented and the designer wasn't there, for example, the other 3 members of customer success in this broader audience would automatically vouch for this person. Hey, we have some person who's very close to the user who would probably be able to comment better on it. Let us get like let's make sure we get his opinion on it as well. So it's automatically like a chain reaction directly powered by the fact that you're working very closely with the stakeholders.
got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to jump to a more fun, controversial question. Number 6. What is the most ridiculous thing you have heard from someone in a leadership position who is not familiar with design? We can anonymize these questions or these answers.
Ridiculous can be a lot of different things. The easiest one, I think, which everyone has probably heard, is that we don't need designers, or I've already done it, or he's already done it. Sorry about that.
No problem.
But I personally feel there are a lot of horror stories which I think I've been blessed with not being part of too many of these.
Okay, that is a best situation.
That's like a blessing.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Kanika, from your perspective, and we can be like, this is sort of a more fun question. So also you can reframe it a little bit with something that just didn't make sense to you or something of that sort.
I think I've heard the thing that stood out to me the most was, what is it that you guys will find out that we don't already know? So it's just that there's such deep.
And you should know this already. You should already know what you'll find out.
We've already ran a survey for this, guys. Why are you here?
Yeah.
Right. And just as like service providers, you want to run away from that conversation.
And I think it's also very, very interesting that if you technically look at it, there's already the quantitative research which a lot of the market insight teams or the ground teams conduct. So one of the very interesting things which I'm not 100% sure if it's like it applies to other places as well. But one of the things which usually is happening, that a lot of the teams are usually carrying out surveys. and a lot of it is actually leading questions. So everyone can actually just skew the results in however sort of confirmation biasy way they want it. So that's something which we've actively been able to challenge, that, hey, surveys are great, but have you even questioned the survey design of it? Let's even talk about what you want out of this. Do you just want numbers to prove, like, please people, or do you really want to understand whatever's happening in reality? So I feel a lot of it is also like exactly what Kanika mentioned, that their interpretation of what design is, and then they've already done their fair share of it.
Yeah, that we've definitely come across that too. And just as we were talking to somebody a few days ago about essentially judging customer experience, and the 1 to 5 rating that customers at the end of their experience are giving the company. And if the goal is to just get that rating be better over time, we can just rephrase that question, and it will eventually, you'll get the better answers. Like your rating will improve just how you frame the question. So that shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be slightly deeper, and that should just be one of the data points you use in judging how you're doing. So the question number 8 here is slightly longer, and I think Kanika, you'd be in a good place to answer that. Is around testing prototypes. So often when the user said when they test low fidelity prototypes, which might be quicker to build and the stuff we've been talking about, users don't understand them as well. Whereas when they're final screens and sort of developed UI, people have a much easier time understanding them and giving feedback. So how do you balance these, and what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Having a higher fidelity prototype obviously will give us a lot more insights because people are seeing it in a way that's closest to what the real product will look like. Having said that, we've seen a fair bit of success with sacrificial prototypes if we know exactly what we're testing, right? So then you sketch out on your paper and you find creative ways to highlight what you want or highlight the kind of things you're trying to unearth. So for instance, yeah, like as simple as something as tactical as we will only print one screen on one page. So then the person's able to see everything on that one screen. The other thing that we've done is we've always backed paper prototype research with some more qualitative questions. So there will be a few more questions that kind of back that concept. Additionally, there might be some activities, so like ranking, sorting. So if you want to test the different interactions, so you want to test, say, like a celebratory moment after they finish a particular transaction. You want to figure out whether they want something that's more joyful or they want something that's just functional, telling them what the payment was, etc. Right? So then you can show them 4 different screens and ask them to rank it, and then follow it up with questions. So you don't typically show them just one thing. If you're using a paper prototype, you will show them a few variations so that you're asking them questions that follow it up. And that's how you're trying to learn. And that's how you make the paper prototype a little bit more rigorous compared to say a digital prototype.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think so. One thing that I'm noticing there as a pattern might be that maybe not ask, basically the low fidelity and high fidelity sort of require different kinds of questions to be asked, or different kinds of things that you want to learn from them. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think jumping to something that Arsalan is aimed at Arsalan, how did design play a role in determining the product market fit at Bazaar? And I think there were some other questions around product market fit as well. So if you want to expand on that area generally, that'll be really useful as well.
I feel it's an evolving conversation, and I feel that's what startups do for the majority of whatever their lifetime is. I feel, again, the whole process is pretty much intact, and the whole idea is that you, like we've talked about previously as well, it's also always about iteration, and the iteration is not just from the lens of the experience, but also the business use cases, the users, their problems, the solutions, how is the ecosystem evolving over time? How are your strategies keeping up with a lot of these changes? And then what's your long-term play? What are you getting at? What's your strategy? So I think it's all cumulative. I personally, again, coming back to the very first question, it's not just the design team only playing their part, but it's like a cumulative combination of all teams playing their own parts. And then obviously it has to be driven through vision and strategy, right? So you have a clear vision, which is basically leading and taking charge on all of these things. And I feel it's not something which it isn't a siloed effort, is all I'm trying to say. And design is just one of the many sort of stakeholders, or design performs some activities which might be part of a lot of different activities which a mix of stakeholders are best positioned to do. And I feel it's like a directional target which you don't really reach, because that's what you're optimizing for as an entity anyways. So I don't think it's like a destination, it's almost like a journey. Sorry, very random philosophical meme content, but I feel that's where it makes sense.
That'll be my new wallpaper, quoting you on that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're sort of towards the end, but maybe we can answer the last question, which is, I think we've covered the rest. Actually, Kanika kind of alluded to number 7 in one. So we're left with number 3, which is, are there any notable differences between similar groups from Pakistan and India in terms of tech use or behavior?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. I think we see a lot of similarities. India is also a heavily cash-based economy, but I think one difference we've noticed in the last 3 years is that there's a lot more willingness to adopt digital payments in India, just given the unified payment interface. And because of that, there is a lot more, I think, familiarity and fluency with digital interactions, including high-stake interactions like transferring money, earning, selling online, which when we compared it to merchants in Pakistan, I think, or even users in Pakistan, I think they're still predominantly cash-based, though I think with RAS and other things coming up, can possibly see a big difference. I think the only other thing that I noticed, and I might not be entirely correct here, is that data seems to still be very much cheaper in India than in Pakistan. I think it's also cheap, but in India it's effectively free. So there's everyone uses or there's at least one smartphone in every household, and a lot of women as well are now quite comfortable on WhatsApp, on YouTube, which we've seen lesser so in Pakistan, especially among the women. The men mostly use it, but we've not seen as many women kind of come into it. We're seeing changes. In fact, Ali and as we worked on a project recently with rural women in Pakistan, and in some of the states, we saw some women who were very adept and fluent, but in some of the more rural parts, I think we saw that they weren't as comfortable using a mobile phone. It wasn't encouraged in their families and stuff. So I think those are the two big differences that I've noticed through my work.
Yeah, that's sort of what my guess would have been too, even though I haven't quite worked in India, but just from like the references I've seen. And I think interestingly, I feel a few years ago when I would read some studies from India, they would coincide very well with what we were seeing in Pakistan. But I feel like over the last 3 or 4 years, with more of these digitalizations happening at the national level in India, that sped up the process of tech literacy. And that's where I think India sort of outpaced Pakistan in the last few years in terms of uptake. But we're sort of, again, as you mentioned, RAST and a few other sort of interventions like that, hopefully, where the hope is to accelerate that process here as well. Yeah, I think, so we're basically at time now, and this I think the conversation has flowed quite well, at least for me. And I hope everyone attending this has enjoyed it. And Kanika, Arslan, I hope you guys did too. And thank you so much for joining. I think the recording of this will be available, I don't know exactly when, but at some point on our pages as well. So we'll share them with you guys as well. And hopefully this can be a document that other people can also benefit from. Thank you so much, Kanika. Thank you, Arsalan. And thank you everyone for joining.
Bye.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.